They laughed when I placed a plain envelope on the table in Chicago's most exclusive dining room. My father called it a loser's gift, while his new wife turned his 63rd birthday dinner into a public humiliation. None knew it was not a card, but the absolute power to dictate who lost their company, home, and reputation. The moment I delivered exactly one line, their entire world began to collapse. My name is Schuyler Parker. At 36 years of age, I had perfected the rigorous, calculated architecture of invisibility. I drove a highly reliable, 7-year-old Japanese sedan down the gleaming, rain-slicked asphalt of Chicago's Gold Coast. The engine hummed a quiet, unassuming rhythm that blended perfectly with the ambient noise of the city, drawing exactly zero attention from the pedestrians wrapped in designer trench coats. I wore a tailored but entirely unbranded charcoal wool blazer over a simple black silk camisole. My trousers were cut cleanly, my shoes were flat, sensible leather loafers, and I was entirely devoid of any recognizable logos, statement jewelry, or the desperate, flashy markers of new wealth. To the casual observer, I was just another mid-level financial analyst, perhaps an auditor or a risk manager, commuting home after a long shift of crunching numbers in a sterile corporate cubicle. That was precisely the illusion I cultivated, and it was a highly effective one. The dashboard clock read 6:45 in the evening. I pulled to a stop at a red light on Oak Street, the neon reflections from high-end boutiques bleeding across my windshield. My phone, resting face down on the passenger seat, gave a short, muted vibration. I picked it up, bypassing the standard lock screen to access a secure, heavily encrypted messaging protocol. It was a text from my executive assistant at North Ledger Restructuring Group, the highly secretive and utterly ruthless distressed asset management firm where I spent my days acting as the architect of corporate life and death. The message was brief, clinical, and devoid of any personal warmth. It read, "Timelines synchronized, awaiting final confirmation." I typed a single letter in response, an affirmative, and locked the screen. The light turned green. Tonight was not about corporate restructuring, at least not in the traditional, boardroom sense of the word. Tonight was a deeply personal affair. It was my father's 63rd birthday dinner. The chosen venue was Ardent House, a fiercely exclusive bastion of culinary opulence nestled in the heart of the Gold Coast. It was the sort of establishment where the waiting list stretched out for 9 agonizing months, where the tasting menu cost more than what a family of 4 spent on groceries in a quarter of a year, and where the wine list was presented in a leather-bound tome the size of an encyclopedia. It was a temple dedicated to excess, and it was exactly the kind of place my father, Grant Parker, and his new wife, Vanessa Locke, used as a theatrical stage to perform their wealth for an audience of equally desperate peers. I pulled up to the curb. I handed my keys to the valet, a young man who barely suppressed a flicker of disdain as he slid into the driver's seat of my unremarkable vehicle. He quickly moved it out of sight to make room for the incoming parade of imported European sports cars and armored luxury sport utility vehicles. I did not mind his judgment. I carried only 2 items with me: an old, well-worn oxblood leather briefcase that had seen me through my toughest, most exhausting years of law school and junior associate drudgery, and a simple brown craft paper envelope. The maitre d' guided me through the dimly lit, velvet-draped main dining room toward the private enclave secluded in the back. The air was thick with the scent of shaved white truffles, expensive oud perfume, and the unmistakable, suffocating weight of old money trying desperately to maintain its grip while new money loudly demanded a seat at the table. My scuffed leather bag and the humble, slightly textured paper envelope in my hand provided a deliberate, jarring visual contrast to the cascading crystal chandeliers and the meticulously applied gold leaf accents of the walls. I liked the physical weight of the envelope. It felt grounding. It felt like tangible truth in a room built entirely on highly leveraged lies. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early. This was not born of familial politeness. It was a deeply ingrained professional reflex. When you spend your life dissecting the catastrophic financial failures of massive corporations, When you make your living recovering hidden assets from arrogant individuals who believe they are utterly untouchable, you learn to control the physical environment before the environment has a chance to control you. I entered the private room and took the seat facing the main entrance. My eyes automatically mapped the dimensions of the space. I noted the two primary exits and a secondary, discreetly paneled service door connecting directly to the kitchen corridor. I counted 3 discrete security cameras tucked seamlessly into the ornate molding near the ceiling, their tiny lenses providing full coverage of the long mahogany table. I observed the subtle, rhythmic patterns of the waitstaff hovering outside the door, measuring their attentiveness and predicting their intrusion points. The acoustics of the room were perfectly engineered with heavy drapery and acoustic paneling to dampen sound, ensuring that whatever shouting matches or whispered conspiracies happened in this enclave stayed strictly within its 4 walls. It was an ideal setting for a quiet execution. Sitting in the climate-controlled luxury of the room, my mind drifted to the guest of honor and his gleaming new bride. Grant was a man who worshipped exclusively at the altar of social perception. He had spent his entire adult life chasing a level of elite society that had always managed to keep him securely at the periphery, allowing him just enough access to keep him spending well beyond his actual means. Then came Vanessa. At 42 years of age, Vanessa Locke was a masterclass in manufactured prestige. She had built an aggressive, highly publicized image as a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur. She was the founder and face of a rapidly expanding chain of luxury wellness and longevity clinics. Her brand capitalized on the deepest fears of the ultra-rich, selling absolute physical perfection, cellular youth preservation, and holistic supremacy through highly questionable intravenous drips and outrageously priced stem cell facials. She plastered her flawlessly contoured face across glossy regional magazines, sponsored lavish charity galas, and ensured that everyone in her orbit knew exactly how many millions she projected her company was worth. To my father and Vanessa, I was the family's singular, unspoken disappointment. I was the unremarkable offspring who had miserably failed to launch into their glittering, champagne-soaked stratosphere. I consistently declined invitations to attend their highly publicized events. I did not wear the recognizable designer labels that screamed their exorbitant price tags to anyone looking. I lived quietly in a modest, mortgage-free townhouse and kept my demanding professional life entirely segregated from their frantic social climbing. Because I never boasted about my annual income, because I never dropped the names of the billionaires I forced into bankruptcy, and because I held a job title they did not bother to understand, they simply assumed I possessed no wealth and no influence. They looked at my quiet demeanor, my cheap car, and my absolute lack of social media presence, and they diagnosed me with a chronic, terminal case of mediocrity. In their eyes, I was merely a low-level accountant or a struggling clerk, a woman who scraped by on a meager salary, entirely devoid of ambition, intelligence, or flair. That false narrative suited them perfectly, especially when contrasted with my younger half-sister, Brooke Parker. For as long as my memory served, Brooke had been my father's undisputed golden child. Brooke was the loud, vibrant, emotionally volatile epicenter of Grant's world. While I had been left to navigate suffocating student loans, grueling 90-hour work weeks during my internships, and the brutal arena of distressed asset restructuring entirely on my own, Brooke had been handed the golden keys to the kingdom from birth. Her out-of-state college tuition, her series of luxury downtown apartments, her lavish 6-figure wedding to a pompous corporate lawyer, all of it had been generously bankrolled by Grant's desperate need to play the benevolent, successful patriarch. Brooke's entire existence was subsidized by our father. Yet she walked through the world with the unearned confidence of a self-made titan. The family treated my fierce financial independence not as a triumph of character, but as an embarrassing, stubborn refusal to participate in their grand collective performance of wealth. They viewed my quiet life as a personal insult to their loud one. I raised my hand and traced the sharp edge of the craft paper envelope with my index finger. The paper was slightly rough, a stark, unforgiving textural difference from the flawlessly pressed, high thread count linen tablecloth spread out beneath it. I had not come to Arden House tonight looking to draw blood. Despite everything, despite the years of subtle neglect and the constant, grating condescension, Grant was still my father. A small, deeply buried, and perhaps foolish part of me had hoped that turning 63 might have finally mellowed him. I harbored a tiny fraction of hope that we could simply share an overpriced meal, exchange hollow but polite pleasantries, and part ways at the end of the night with our carefully maintained, freezing distance intact. I had brought the envelope intending it to be a quiet gesture, a definitive settlement of old lingering debts, and a genuine, highly valuable olive branch. I had planned a night of quiet reconciliation, a chance to wipe a slate clean before it shattered entirely. However, sitting in the absolute silence of the room, I knew them far too well to believe in miracles. I knew the exact way Vanessa's heavily mascaraed eyes would sharpen with predatory glee the moment she registered my unbranded wool blazer. I knew the specific, practiced tone Brooke would use to simper and offer devastating backhanded compliments about my lifestyle. I knew my father would sit at the head of the table, presiding over my orchestrated discomfort like a disappointed king judging a peasant. They thrived on a rigid, immutable hierarchy where I was permanently stationed at the absolute bottom, serving as the necessary pathetic contrast to their brilliant success. The heavy oak door to the private dining room suddenly swung open, held wide by a deferential, white-gloved waiter. The chaotic, clattering ambient noise of the main restaurant briefly flooded the quiet space before being sharply cut off as the door clicked firmly shut. I did not need to look up to know they had arrived. The overwhelming, cloying scent of Vanessa's custom-blended floral perfume preceded her into the room like a warning siren, followed immediately by the sharp, authoritative, echoing click of her designer heels striking the polished hardwood floor. I could hear Brooke's high-pitched laughter echoing off the paneled walls, harmonizing with the booming, artificially deep voice of my father. I remained seated. I kept my hands resting lightly, casually, on the table, the plain brown envelope positioned squarely and perfectly parallel to the edge of the table in front of me. I took a slow, deeply measured breath, letting the residual tension drain out of my shoulders and down my spine. The air in the room shifted instantly, charged with the sudden, suffocating influx of their aggressive, performative energy. The quiet observation phase of the evening was officially over. If they wanted to use this birthday dinner to assert their imaginary dominance, if they intended to turn this evening into a public battlefield to remind me of my supposed inferiority and my rightful place in their world, I was more than ready. I had spent well over a decade clinically dissecting the catastrophic financial ruin of the arrogant, the careless, and the deeply corrupt. I knew exactly how to find the microscopic hairline fractures in a foundation, and I knew exactly how to apply pressure until the entire structure collapsed into dust. They thought they were walking into a luxurious room to put the family disappointment in her rightful place. They expected me to cower, to apologize for my existence, and to quietly absorb their refined cruelty. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a forensic audit, and that I was the one holding the gavel. The flurry of their arrival instantly shattered the meticulously engineered tranquility of the private dining room. Vanessa orchestrated the seating arrangements with the aggressive precision of a battlefield commander positioning her heavy artillery. She ensured she and my father occupied the visual and authoritative center of the long, polished mahogany table, forcing me to take a seat closer to the discreet service door. Brooke glided into the chair directly opposite me, a chaotic cloud of spun sugar, entitlement, and malice. She immediately began adjusting a heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist, ensuring the stones caught the ambient light of the crystal chandelier above us. The waitstaff materialized instantly, a silent, highly synchronized unit pouring sparkling water and unfolding starched white linen napkins with practiced grace. Amidst this flurry of high-end hospitality, Vanessa's sharp, calculating eyes swept across the vast expanse of the table. Her gaze bypassed the sterling silver cutlery and the imported crystal glassware, stopping dead the moment it landed on the brown craft paper envelope resting securely in front of me. A slow, chillingly predatory smirk stretched across her flawlessly contoured face. The physical contrast was, admittedly, jarring. Against the backdrop of a dining experience that demanded an exorbitant financial sacrifice, my simple paper envelope looked entirely out of jurisdiction. "Skylar," Vanessa purred. Her voice was drenched in an artificial saccharine sweetness that barely concealed the corrosive venom bubbling just beneath the surface. "You brought paperwork to a birthday dinner. How incredibly practical of you. Though, I must admit, from this angle, it looks suspiciously like a rejected cover letter." She did not keep her voice contained to the immediate radius of our family. Vanessa possessed a desperate, ingrained need for an audience. She pitched her voice upward, perfectly calibrating the volume to ensure it carried to the ears of the sommelier, who was currently presenting a thick, leather-bound wine ledger to my father. "Honestly, Grant," Vanessa sighed dramatically, waving a hand adorned with a massive, emerald-cut engagement ring toward my side of the table. "We are sitting in a private enclave at Ardent House. The minimum spend for this room alone is $3,000 before we even order a single appetizer, and your eldest daughter brings a gift that looks like it was hurriedly purchased at a suburban craft fair on a rainy Tuesday afternoon." The sommelier stiffened, his eyes strictly trained on the floor, adopting the universal rigid posture of service industry professionals forced to witness the vicious blood sport of the ultra-wealthy. I turned my gaze to my father, allowing a small, lingering fragment of a daughter's instinct to surface, waiting to see if he would finally draw a line. I waited to see if he would defend me, or at the very least, demand basic civility on the evening of his 63rd birthday. Grant Parker did not flinch. He did not offer even the flimsiest protective shield. Instead, he slowly placed the heavy wine menu onto the table, taking a moment to adjust the cuffs of his bespoke Italian shirt so the solid gold links gleamed prominently under the recessed lights. He looked across the table at me, his face settling into a heavy, practiced mask of profound, exhausting disappointment. "Vanessa makes a valid point, Skylar," my father murmured, his tone laced with the weary patience of a man addressing a perpetually slow child. "It is a milestone birthday. We are attempting to celebrate a lifetime of hard work and success. You could have made a marginal effort to understand the standard expected in a venue like this. It simply baffles me that after all these years, you still blatantly refuse to learn how to behave according to the class and the caliber of this family." The betrayal was not sharp. It was dull, familiar, and incredibly heavy. He was fundamentally incapable of siding with anything that lacked a luxury brand logo, emboldened by her husband's immediate and unconditional surrender. Vanessa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the immaculate linen. The defensive perimeter was officially down, and she was moving in for a closer, more deeply personal kill. Her eyes, sharp, dark, and utterly devoid of warmth, raked over the simple, unbranded charcoal wool jacket I wore. "It is not merely the tragic little envelope, Grant. Look at her overall presentation. We are dining at one of the most exclusive culinary establishments in the Midwest, a place where people book tables a year in advance, and she shows up wearing the exact uniform of a small county accountant who just got passed over for a mid-level promotion." The insult was surgically precise. It was not a random jab. It was a carefully aimed arrow striking squarely at a very old, deeply entrenched family narrative. It touched directly upon the historical sore spot that had defined my existence in their eyes. They had spent over 2 decades categorizing me as the mundane, uninspired, and hopelessly average drone of the bloodline. By calling me a small county accountant, Vanessa was publicly validating every sneering assumption they had ever made about my intelligence, my drive, and my ultimate worth in the world. The air in the room thickened instantly, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the space transformed from an elegant dining area into a brutal, unforgiving social tribunal. The ambient noise of clinking silverware ceased entirely. Every eye at the table locked onto me. They were waiting for the psychological structural integrity to fail. They wanted a frantic, ugly flush of humiliation to creep up my neck and stain my cheeks. They wanted me to stammer out a pathetic, defensive excuse about my personal budget, or far better, they wanted me to lose my temper, raise my voice, and storm out of the restaurant, thereby cementing my designated role as the unstable, ungrateful outcast who simply could not handle their elevated world. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not break eye contact. I did not let my breathing shallow or my pulse quicken. I kept my internal rhythm perfectly steady, maintaining a heart rate of perhaps 60 beats per minute. I reached out with my right hand, my movements agonizingly slow, fluid, and utterly deliberate. I placed my fingertips on the rough, textured edge of the craft paper envelope. With a gentle, measured motion, I pulled it exactly 2 inches closer to my chest. I aligned it perfectly parallel to the sharp edge of the table, running my thumb along the seam to smooth out an invisible, microscopic crease. I treated the envelope with the quiet reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic, completely ignoring the toxic verbal waste spilling across the table. My absolute refusal to engage created a vacuum, and my younger half-sister immediately rushed in to fill it. Brooke let out a high, melodic laugh that grated fiercely against the sophisticated acoustic paneling of the room. "Oh, you have to leave her alone, Vanessa," Brooke chimed in. Her tone was completely devoid of any actual sisterly defense. It was drenched in a suffocating, patronizing pity. "You know, Skylar has always possessed her own very unique, very specific aesthetic. Remember when we were teenagers? Grant used to buy me those beautiful custom-fitted silk dresses from the elite boutiques down on Michigan Avenue for the holidays. Meanwhile, Skylar would show up to Sunday dinners wearing oversized, drab clothes that looked like they were hastily rescued from a suburban charity bin. It was the absolute running family joke for a solid 10 years. We used to place bets on what shade of gray she would wear next. Brooke smiled warmly at me across the table, a venomous viper dressed impeccably in a pale pink designer gown. The tribunal was now in full session. The sommelier still stood frozen by the heavily draped wall, actively trying to render his physical form invisible, while his ears absorbed every single drop of the aristocratic poison being spilled onto the pristine tablecloth. My father watched me from the head of the table. His expression was a complex mixture of impatience and mild, aristocratic embarrassment, fully expecting me to quietly absorb the heavy blows and silently apologize for ruining the visual aesthetic of his perfect evening. I lifted my gaze from the perfectly aligned edges of the envelope. I met Vanessa's triumphant, burning stare, holding it for 3 long, silent seconds, before shifting my eyes to Brooke's eager, mocking face. I did not raise the volume of my voice by a single decibel. I did not infuse a single ounce of anger, defensiveness, or hurt into my tone. "I truly appreciate your deep concern for my wardrobe, Vanessa," I said. My voice was perfectly level, carrying the polite, chillingly detached cadence of a corporate executive speaking to a highly unreasonable, low-tier vendor. "And Brooke, your memory of our shared childhood remains as colorful and selective as ever. I have always found a great deal of comfort in practicality." The absolute lack of emotional recoil landed like a lead weight in the center of the table. I did not give them the friction they desperately craved. I offered no resistance for them to push against. Vanessa's triumphant smirk faltered, slipping from her face for a fraction of a second before she hastily pinned it back in place. The muscles along her sharp jawline tightened visibly, a tiny rhythmic pulsing that betrayed her sudden loss of control. There is nothing more infuriating to a dedicated professional bully than a target that simply refuses to bleed. She had deployed her sharpest, most historically effective knives, fully expecting a satisfying scream of pain or a pathetic whimper of defeat. Instead, her carefully honed blades had struck solid, unyielding titanium, dulling her weapons upon impact. She shifted heavily in her plush chair, the loud, aggressive rustle of her expensive silk dress broadcasting a sudden, violent spike of irritation. She crossed her arms, her posture closing off. She had entirely failed to break me. In the vicious, unspoken rules of their shallow social games, a failure to elicit a reaction from the victim was a definitive failure to win the round. Her annoyance radiated across the table, a palpable heat that I found deeply, quietly satisfying. I lowered my eyes, returning my calm gaze to the plain brown envelope resting quietly under the protective shelter of my hands. It was a genuinely fascinating psychological phenomenon. Sitting here and watching them operate under such a profound collective delusion. For over 20 years, they had consistently, aggressively mistaken my strategic silence for absolute submission. They had looked at my carefully maintained composure, my refusal to engage in their screaming matches, and my quiet retreat into my own life, and they had diagnosed it as an inherent, fatal weakness. They saw a lack of fight, a quiet resignation to my designated role as the lesser, failed daughter. They genuinely believed that because I did not raise my voice, I lacked the capacity to strike back. They were fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. They always mistook calmness for weakness. They mistook my observation for ignorance. They thought I was sitting at this table as their designated prey. They had absolutely no comprehension of the fact that the quietest person in the room is often the only one holding the matches. And tonight, in this gilded, soundproofed room, they were entirely unprepared to pay the devastating price for that historical miscalculation. Brooke, acutely sensing that Vanessa's frontal assault had violently stalled against my absolute refusal to react, immediately deployed her favorite secondary weapon. She turned her body entirely toward her husband, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his forearm, as if officially tagging him into the center of the ring. Dean Lowe was 34 years of age, though he carried himself with the rigid, unbearable self-importance of a man twice that age. He possessed the kind of sharply styled, heavily gelled hair and tightly tailored navy suits that acted as a universal uniform for aggressively mediocre corporate lawyers trying desperately to project alpha dominance. Dean fundamentally believed that every single thought generating within his mind was a profound, indisputable piece of philosophical gold. He did not engage in conversations. He delivered sermons from an imaginary pulpit, entirely convinced that everyone around him was starved for his particular brand of intellectual charity. You know, Brooke brings up a fascinating point regarding your overall trajectory, Dean began, leaning back in his plush leather chair and steepling his fingers together in a textbook display of manufactured authority. He pitched his voice an octave lower, adopting the soothing, condescending cadence of a seasoned professional explaining a highly complex concept to a particularly slow toddler. We were actually having a leadership meeting at Lowell Pike and Crest just this past Tuesday. The firm is expanding its back-office operations. We have a massive influx of low-level compliance logging and basic physical document retention that frankly does not require a law degree to manage. He paused, allowing the sheer magnitude of his upcoming benevolence to hang heavily in the climate-controlled air of the private dining room. I could speak to the Human Resources Director on Monday, Dean continued, offering me a smile dripping with weaponized pity. I could easily bypass the standard interview protocols for you. We could bring you in as a Tier 1 administrative assistant. It pays $42,000 a year, which I am sure would be a substantial upgrade for your current living situation. It includes standard health benefits, and it would finally get you out of whatever dead-end data entry purgatory you are currently trapped in. It is incredibly honest, simple work. You would just be filing, answering the secondary overflow phone lines, and ensuring the partner lounges are adequately stocked. The sheer audacity of the offer hung suspended over the table for a fraction of a second before the entire group collectively embraced the narrative. Brooke let out a soft, delighted gasp, clutching Dean's arm tighter as if he had just heroically leaped into a freezing river to save a drowning orphan. Vanessa offered a low, thoroughly entertained chuckle, highly amused by the concept of me fetching coffee for junior associates at a mid-market law firm. They laughed together, a harmonious chorus of absolute, unadulterated condescension. They genuinely framed this humiliating, entry-level clerical position as a monumental family favor. In reality, it was a highly strategic, perfectly executed maneuver designed to violently shove me down into the exact socioeconomic basement where they felt I belonged. By offering to become my employer, Dean was attempting to establish total, unbreakable supremacy over my life. My father, who had remained entirely passive during Vanessa's vicious critique of my clothing, suddenly found his voice. Grant Parker reached out and wrapped his fingers around his heavy crystal tumbler, filled with expensive, small-batch bourbon. He lifted the glass directly toward his son-in-law. "To Dean," my father proclaimed, his voice thick with genuine, glowing admiration. "Here is a man who actually understands how to build a lasting foundation. A man who knows how to carry the heavy weight of real responsibility and still has the grace to look back and offer a hand to those who cannot seem to find their own footing." Grant took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes darting toward me, ensuring I fully absorbed the devastating, implicit comparison. He was publicly crowning Dean as the successful, highly capable son he had always desperately wanted, using my perceived failure as the dark, muddy background required to make Dean's imaginary brilliance shine brighter. Vanessa, utterly emboldened by the shifting, aggressive momentum of the table, leaned forward. Her diamond necklace caught the light, flashing like a warning beacon. She was not about to let Dean take all the credit for my public execution. "Grant is absolutely right, and you really should listen to Dean," Vanessa instructed, her tone sharpening into a harsh, unforgiving edge. "Let us look at the cold, objective facts of your life. You have no husband to provide a secondary income or social anchor. You own absolutely no property, stubbornly renting that depressing little unit on the edge of the city. You possess zero personal brand and zero marketable equity in the social sphere." She forcefully swept her hand through the air, dismissing my entire existence with one broad, decisive gesture. "If you are fundamentally incapable of generating real, tangible wealth, the very least you could do is learn how to make the family look presentable." Vanessa continued, her voice rising in volume, ensuring the waitstaff hovering near the door could hear every single syllable. "Taking a respectable, structured job under Dean's direct supervision would at least give you a legitimate title to hide behind when our friends ask what on earth you do all day. You owe it to your father to stop being such a glaring, unexplainable liability to the Parker family name." I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table, my fingers brushing the edge of my brown paper envelope. I did not interrupt her monologue. I did not attempt to defend my housing choices or my relationship status. Instead, I engaged the highly specialized, analytical sector of my brain, the exact same sector I used when tearing apart heavily redacted corporate tax returns. I began quietly, clinically dissecting the two loudest people in the room. I looked at Dean. Emboldened by my silence, he had launched into a deeply arrogant, winding story about a recent contract negotiation his firm had allegedly dominated. However, as he spoke, the glaring, catastrophic holes in his professional armor became glaringly obvious to anyone who actually understood high-level corporate law. "We absolutely crushed opposing counsel," Dean boasted, slicing into his appetizer with unnecessary force. "They tried to claim basic negligence, but I immediately invoked res ipsa loquitur to pierce their corporate veil, and then I threatened them with a full mens rea violation if they did not immediately settle the escrow accounts." I stared at him, my expression entirely blank, while my mind rapidly catalogued the profound, almost comical level of his incompetence. He had just aggressively combined a standard tort doctrine, a complex corporate liability shield, and a strictly criminal state-of-mind requirement into a single, nonsensical sentence regarding a standard civil escrow dispute. It was the legal equivalent of a toddler mashing 3 different jigsaw puzzles together with a hammer and proudly declaring it a masterpiece. Dean Lowe was not a formidable corporate shark. He was an empty, echoing vessel who had memorized a handful of intimidating Latin phrases and utilized them entirely out of context to bully small business owners and impress his equally ignorant in-laws. He was heavily reliant on theatrical aggression to mask a severe deficit of actual technical intelligence. This specific observation was incredibly valuable. It was a massive, glowing structural weakness I carefully logged away for the precise moment I decided to tear his firm apart, having diagnosed Dean's fatal flaw. I subtly shifted my visual focus to Vanessa. While she loudly lectured me on the vital importance of maintaining a personal brand, Her physical body language was betraying a completely different, highly frantic narrative. I noticed that her sleek, imported titanium smartphone was not tucked away in her designer clutch. It was resting face up right next to her silver oyster fork. Every 60 to 80 seconds, the screen would silently illuminate with a notification. Each time the device lit up, Vanessa's meticulously practiced posture would rigidly snap. Her eyes would dart downward, her breathing would shallow, and the flawlessly painted fingernails of her left hand would tap a frantic, erratic rhythm against the heavy linen tablecloth. She was sweating, an invisible, cold panic radiating from her despite the icy air conditioning of the room. She was desperately, agonizingly waiting for a specific financial confirmation. I knew exactly what that confirmation was. She was waiting for the final, multi-million-dollar funding wire to clear from a massive, faceless private equity firm, a vital injection of capital required to aggressively expand her luxury clinic empire and cover the massive, bleeding operational deficits she was desperately hiding from her current investors. She was projecting the image of a titan, but she was physically vibrating with the sheer terror of a woman heavily leveraged on borrowed time and borrowed money. Dean, entirely oblivious to his mother-in-law's silent, creeping panic, and entirely convinced of his own absolute victory over me, raised his water glass to deliver his final crushing verdict. "The harsh reality of the corporate world is very simple," Dean pontificated, staring directly into my eyes. "People without any upward momentum, people who have clearly plateaued at the absolute bottom of the ladder, should learn to be exceedingly grateful for small, unexpected opportunities. Pride is a highly expensive luxury. Skylar, it is a luxury only the truly successful can actually afford to keep." The private dining room fell into a heavy, dramatic silence. The entire family leaned back in their chairs, a collective jury entirely satisfied with the brutal, comprehensive sentence they had just publicly handed down. They waited eagerly for the final result. They waited for my shoulders to slump, for my eyes to drop to my lap in total defeat, and for me to quietly, pathetically accept the agonizing clerical job just to stop the relentless verbal beating. Instead, I looked directly at Dean's aggressively smug face. I looked at Vanessa's twitching, anxious fingers hovering over her glowing phone screen. I looked at my father's disappointed, arrogant sneer. And then, for the absolute first time since stepping foot inside Ardent House, I smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a slow, fractional upward curve of the lips that did not reach my eyes. It was a highly controlled, purely mechanical adjustment of facial muscles. To them, it might have looked like a bizarre, fragile defense mechanism, the nervous, cracking reaction of a woman who had finally been pushed past her breaking point, but it was not a concession. It was the cold, silent, invisible turning of a key in a very heavy lock. The meticulous phase of observation was officially complete. The psychological profiles were locked, the glaring weaknesses were fully exposed, and the targets had willingly walked themselves into the exact center of the blast radius. They thought my smile meant I was finally surrendering to their superior reality. They did not realize that the countdown clock had just hit 0, and their manufactured world was about to be aggressively, permanently restructured. The quiet, almost imperceptible shift in my expression seemed to trigger a deep, primal alarm within my stepmother. My absolute refusal to break down or accept Dean's humiliating job offer had created a suffocating tension she could no longer tolerate. She needed a decisive, crushing victory, and in her highly manufactured world, absolute power was exclusively demonstrated through the aggressive deployment of capital. She raised her hand and sharply snapped her fingers, a vulgar, demanding gesture that shattered the refined ambiance of the room. The sommelier, who had been hovering at a respectful distance, immediately stepped forward. He moved with the stiff, carefully cultivated grace of a man accustomed to dealing with the violent whims of the ultra-rich. Vanessa did not even glance at the extensive, leather-bound wine ledger resting on the table. She looked directly past the sommelier, addressing him as if he were a mildly irritating piece of interactive furniture. She demanded the immediate cancellation of the standard pairing menu we had previously discussed. Instead, she loudly requested a highly specific, notoriously rare vintage of French Burgundy. She articulated the name of the estate with a heavily exaggerated, entirely incorrect accent. I knew the exact market value of that particular bottle. It hovered right around $14,000. It was a wine meant to be quietly revered by serious collectors, not aggressively guzzled by a woman trying to win a petty family argument. The sommelier blinked, a micro-expression of professional shock flickering across his trained features before he smoothed it away. He politely attempted to suggest a slightly more accessible, yet still incredibly prestigious alternative, gently hinting that the chosen vintage required hours of careful decanting. Vanessa cut him off with a sharp wave of her manicured hand. She then proceeded to order the imperial caviar service for the entire table, specifically demanding the golden reserve grade and insisting it be served with traditional mother-of-pearl spoons and a chilled bottle of premium Russian vodka. She followed this by upgrading our entire dining experience to the chef's elite grand tasting menu, a sprawling 14-course affair that cost precisely $950 per person, completely independent of the staggering alcohol tab she had just initiated. She was rapidly, intentionally inflating the evening's expense to a level that would induce a panic attack in any normal working-class citizen. As the sommelier bowed and retreated to fulfill her outrageous demands, Vanessa leaned back in her chair. She steepled her fingers, her heavy diamond rings catching the overhead light, and fixed her dark, calculating eyes squarely on me. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was laid, and she was ready to spring the mechanism. You know, considering Dean was generous enough to offer you a legitimate lifeline out of your depressing little administrative rut, Vanessa announced, her voice echoing loudly in the secluded room. I think it is only fair that you demonstrate a modicum of gratitude. You have spent your entire adult life coasting on the absolute periphery of this family, contributing absolutely nothing to our collective standing. It is high time you proved you still belong at this table. She paused, allowing the sheer weight of her upcoming demand to settle over the pristine linen. You will be covering the entire check for your father's birthday dinner tonight, she declared. The absolute finality in her tone left zero room for negotiation. She delivered the mandate not as a request, but as a sovereign decree. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the mahogany table. The sheer financial violence of her demand was staggering. With the rare vintage wine, the imported caviar, the upgraded tasting menus, and the mandatory 20% gratuity automatically applied to private rooms at Ardent House, the final bill would easily eclipse $25,000. She was deliberately trying to force me into a corner where I would have to publicly admit I did not possess the funds, thereby cementing my status as the impoverished, failed outcast, or force me to drain my supposed meager life savings just to survive the evening. My father shifted in his seat at the head of the table. I looked toward him, waiting to see if the sheer absurdity of forcing his allegedly struggling daughter to pay a 5-figure restaurant bill would finally override his desperate need for Vanessa's approval. It did not. Grant Parker cleared his throat, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. Vanessa is completely right, he stated, his voice thick with a heavy, manufactured sorrow. It is a matter of basic respect. I have provided for you your entire life. I paid for your braces. I put clothes on your back when you were a child. Taking care of this one evening is the absolute minimum you could do to show that you are not entirely selfish. If you refuse to honor me on my milestone birthday, it simply proves that you are as ungrateful and bitter as Vanessa says you are. It was a masterful, toxic deployment of parental guilt, weaponizing his basic biological obligations from 30 years ago to extort a fortune from me in the present. Across the table, Brooke leaned toward the service door. A waiter had just silently entered to refill our crystal water goblets. Brooke looked directly at the young man, offering him a conspiratorial, mocking smirk. Do not worry about bringing the check to the head of the table later, she instructed him loudly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. My sister will be handling the entire account tonight. She is treating us, finally, the waiter offered a stiff, uncomfortable nod, and quickly vanished. Eager to escape the suffocating crossfire, the table had officially formed a united front. They had built a wall of social and familial pressure, completely convinced I would crumble underneath the sheer weight of it. Dean, sensing an opportunity to showcase his imaginary intellectual superiority, eagerly inserted himself into the execution. He adjusted his silk tie and adopted his most insufferable, courtroom-ready posture. If we look at this from a purely objective, quasi-legal standpoint, Dean began, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension, there is an implied fiduciary duty inherent in the familial unit. You have historically failed to provide any equitable contribution to the Parker family enterprise. You do not host events. You do not contribute to the shared vacation properties. You do not elevate the public portfolio. Absorbing the cost of this celebratory dinner is merely a rudimentary form of social restitution. It balances the ledger, so to speak. It is an investment in your own severely depleted social capital. He used the terminology of corporate law to justify a petty, mean-spirited shakedown. It was intellectually bankrupt, but it served its purpose perfectly. It wrapped their raw cruelty in a thin, fragile veneer of logical justification. I let the absolute absurdity of their demands wash over me. I looked at the three of them, the aging patriarch terrified of losing his status, the desperate stepmother violently bleeding cash, and the arrogant brother-in-law playing pretend lawyer. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived power. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not raise my voice, nor did I break eye contact with Vanessa. I will not be paying for an incredibly overpriced bottle of Burgundy that I did not order, nor will I be subsidizing a caviar service meant solely to inflate your fragile ego, I stated. My voice was utterly flat, carrying the cold, uncompromising authority of a bank denying a desperate loan application. I will review the itemized receipt at the end of the evening. I will calculate the exact cost of the sparkling water and the single portion of whatever main course I decide to endure. I will add a standard 22% gratuity for the service staff, and I will pay for my own consumption, nothing more. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely predictable. Brooke let out a loud, theatrical gasp of absolute horror, throwing her hand to her chest as if I had just spit directly onto the tablecloth. Dean shook his head in slow, exaggerated disgust, muttering something under his breath about the tragedy of lower-class mentalities. My father closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, physically pantomiming the heavy burden of having raised such a profound disappointment. "Unbelievable," Vanessa hissed. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a sneer of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "Absolutely unbelievable. You are sitting in a room that costs more per hour than your entire monthly rent, and you are aggressively nickel-and-diming your own family over a birthday dinner. You are incredibly, hopelessly stingy." She reached into her heavily branded, imported leather clutch resting on the empty chair beside her. With a swift, aggressive motion, she pulled out a thick, solid metal credit card. It was a notoriously exclusive reserve tier card, the kind issued strictly by invitation to high-net-worth individuals, carrying an astronomical annual fee and supposedly zero spending limits. Vanessa raised her arm and violently slammed the heavy metal card down onto the mahogany table. The sharp metallic clack echoed loudly through the private enclave, a jarring, aggressive sound designed to display absolute financial dominance. "This is the fundamental difference between us, Skylar," Vanessa sneered, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. She tapped her sharply manicured fingernail directly against the engraved metal surface of the card. People who actually know how to generate real, substantial wealth do not waste their precious time arguing with people who are forced to count every single penny. I will pay for this dinner, just like I pay for everything else that keeps this family at the top. And you can take your pathetic, calculated little fraction of the bill and keep it in your cheap checking account where it belongs." She leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest, fully believing she had just delivered the ultimate, unrecoverable killing blow. She had publicly established her overwhelming financial supremacy. She had crushed my rebellion with the sheer, crushing weight of her limitless credit line. I did not flinch when the heavy metal struck the wood. I slowly rotated my left wrist, allowing my sleeve to pull back just enough to reveal the face of my watch. It was not a diamond-encrusted luxury timepiece. It was a highly functional, brutally accurate analog instrument. The second hand swept past the 12. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. I looked away from my watch and shifted my gaze downward, staring directly at the heavy metal card resting aggressively on the table in front of her. I noted the specific banking institution stamped onto the titanium surface. It was the exact institution my firm had been aggressively communicating with for the past 48 hours. My eyes traced the raised numbers on the card, and a profound, icy calm settled deep into my bones. The frantic, anxious energy of the room suddenly felt entirely hollow. They had spent the last 45 minutes building an elaborate, towering monument to their own imaginary supremacy, completely unaware that I had quietly rigged the entire foundation with high-yield explosives. Vanessa was staring at me, her chest heaving slightly, waiting for my final surrender. She was waiting for me to lower my head in shame. She wanted me to feel the crushing, undeniable reality of her wealth. I looked up from the card and met her eyes. The time for quiet observation was officially over. The trap she had so eagerly built for me had just violently snapped shut on her own ankle. The exact moment I had been waiting for all evening had finally arrived. The lingering echoes of Vanessa slamming her heavy titanium card against the mahogany surface seemed to act as a starter pistol for the rest of the table. A fresh, revitalized wave of amusement washed over them. Brooke let out a sharp, breathless giggle, reaching up to delicately dab the corner of her eye, as if the sheer comedy of my impending financial ruin was moving her to tears. Dean threw his head back and produced a loud, booming bark of laughter, the kind of deeply forced, theatrical sound men in dark suits make when they want to broadcast their absolute alignment with the dominant power in the room. Even my father allowed a tight, satisfied smirk to settle onto his features. He reached for his water goblet, his shoulders visibly relaxing. In his mind, the natural order of the universe had been violently but rightfully restored. The rogue, disappointing offspring had attempted to assert a boundary, and the wealthy, successful matriarch had immediately crushed her with the undeniable, absolute weight of limitless capital. It was a language my father understood perfectly, and he was deeply comforted by its swift application. The general manager of Ardent House chose this exact moment to glide into our private enclave. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man in a midnight blue tuxedo, entirely distinct from the standard waitstaff. He had clearly been alerted to the astronomical escalation of our bill and had arrived to personally oversee the establishment of the open tab. He approached the table with the smooth, practiced deference of a man who routinely handled egos far more fragile and bank accounts far more volatile than those currently occupying the room. He stopped at Vanessa's side, offering a shallow, highly respectful bow. He reached out to gently retrieve the heavy metal card resting aggressively on the linen. The entire table was vibrating with a toxic, triumphant energy. They were looking at me, waiting for the devastating reality of my powerlessness to finally register on my face. They wanted to see the exact moment my spirit broke. I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not shift my weight. I did not break my posture. I slowly lifted my chin, bypassing the gloating faces of my family entirely, and locked my eyes directly onto the general manager. "You can go ahead and run Vanessa's card first," I instructed him. My voice was utterly devoid of inflection, slicing cleanly through the thick layer of their manufactured amusement. The freeze order I signed just took effect. For a fraction of a second, the room experienced a total atmospheric vacuum. The words hung in the air, completely alien to the environment. Then, the dam broke, and the table erupted. They did not just laugh, they howled. Brooke slapped the flat of her hand against the table, her diamond bracelets clattering loudly against the wood. Dean shook his head in profound, highly exaggerated pity, muttering about the tragic, pathetic delusions of the chronically unsuccessful. My father pinched the bridge of his nose. physically cringing at what he perceived to be my desperate, deeply embarrassing attempt to string together random financial buzzwords to salvage a shred of my shattered dignity. Vanessa was practically glowing with malicious joy. She viewed my statement as the ultimate, pathetic thrashing of a defeated animal. She looked up at the manager, offering him a brilliant, predatory smile. "Please forgive my stepdaughter," Vanessa purred, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy and genuine malice. "She has a very vivid imagination and a highly unfortunate inferiority complex. Take the card, open the tab, and actually, let us add a second bottle of that $14,000 Burgundy to the order. Keep it decanting in the back. I think we need to celebrate properly, and clearly. Someone at this table needs to learn a very firm, very expensive lesson about how the real world operates." The manager, maintaining his ironclad professional neutrality, offered another slight bow, secured the titanium card in his leather folio, and silently exited the room. The door clicked shut, sealing us back into our private arena. The heavy, oppressive confidence of the room returned tenfold. Brooke immediately began eagerly discussing the upcoming charity gala season, completely ignoring my existence. Dean launched into another unsolicited lecture about the importance of asserting dominance in corporate negotiations. Vanessa sat back, radiating the deep, bone-warming satisfaction of a predator that had just successfully completed a hunt. I sat perfectly still and let them enjoy their victory. I let them bask in the warm, golden glow of their absolute certainty. I counted the seconds in my head. I knew the exact layout of the restaurant's point-of-sale network. I knew the precise distance from our enclave to the primary terminal at the host stand. I calculated the time it would take for the manager to insert the chip, the secondary pause for the satellite uplink to the merchant services provider, the instantaneous routing to the issuing bank, and the brutal, unforgiving digital collision that was about to occur. Exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, the heavy oak door opened again. The general manager stepped back into the room, but the flawless, invisible grace he had exhibited earlier was completely gone. His posture was rigid. His face, previously a mask of polite neutrality, was now visibly pale, bearing the distinct, deeply uncomfortable expression of a man forced to deliver a live explosive to a dinner party. He held a small, black leather presenter tray in his right hand. He did not glide toward the head of the table. He moved with hesitant, agonizingly slow steps, stopping just behind Vanessa's right shoulder. The lively, arrogant chatter of the table began to falter. Sensing the sudden, drastic drop in the atmospheric pressure of the room, the manager leaned down. He did not speak with his previously projected, confident voice. He kept his tone incredibly low, attempting to preserve a shred of discretion, though in the suddenly dead silence of the room, every single syllable was magnified. "Madam," the manager whispered, his voice tight with profound discomfort, "I am terribly sorry to interrupt your evening. However, the terminal has declined the authorization." Vanessa stopped swirling her sparkling water. Her flawlessly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a sharp expression of deep, genuine confusion. "Declined," she repeated, the words sounding completely foreign in her mouth. "That is utterly impossible. It is a reserve tier card. It does not have a preset spending limit. You must have run it incorrectly. The magnetic stripe on those heavy metal cards can be finicky." "Run the chip," the manager swallowed hard, a visible bob of his Adam's apple against his starched collar. He gently placed the black leather tray onto the table. The titanium card sat in the center, alongside a long, curling piece of thermal receipt paper. "I assure you, madam, we utilize the chip reader," the manager explained, his voice trembling slightly. The terminal did not indicate a standard reading error or a simple insufficient funds trigger. The system returned a highly specific merchant code. The exact internal note on the terminal display states, "Account restricted pending covenant review." The words dropped onto the table like heavy lead weights. Vanessa's face underwent a catastrophic transformation. The smug, radiant arrogance instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent flush of dark red fury. Her hands slammed flat against the table. "Covenant review," Vanessa hissed, the volume of her voice spiking aggressively. That is absolutely ridiculous. That makes zero sense. That holding account just received a $45 million capital expansion wire at exactly 9 o'clock this morning from our primary private equity partners. It is overflowing with liquid capital. Your machine is broken. Your entire system is experiencing a catastrophic lag. Take it back and manually punch in the numbers. Call your merchant service provider immediately and demand a bypass. Madam, I have already attempted a manual override, the manager pleaded, physically taking a half-step backward to distance himself from her radiating anger. The issuing bank has placed a hard, unbreakable lock on the credential. I cannot force the transaction through. To prove his point, the manager produced a sleek, handheld wireless terminal from his jacket pocket. He held it up, inserted the titanium card, and turned the screen toward the table. The small digital display flashed a bright, angry red. The words were stark and undeniable. Declined. Holding account frozen. Contact institution. The machine emitted a sharp, highly unpleasant double beep, signaling the absolute failure of the transaction. The sound acted as a physical blow to the room. The lingering, mocking smiles on Brooks and my father's faces were instantly wiped away, replaced by a cold, creeping confusion. The laughter had died completely, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the rapid, shallow sound of Vanessa's panic-induced breathing. Dean, desperate to maintain the illusion of control and completely misreading the severity of the situation, immediately sprang into action. He let out a loud, patronizing sigh, adopting the weary persona of the only competent adult in a room full of technical failures. Everyone needs to calm down, Dean announced, projecting his voice to fill the sudden void. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and withdrew a sleek black leather card holder. Vanessa is completely right. This is a classic case of banking system lag. When you try to authorize a massive, unexpected restaurant tab on a high-tier reserve account, especially after a large, multi-million-dollar inbound wire clears the same day, the automated fraud algorithms frequently panic and lock down the gateway. It is a basic security protocol. Dean pulled out a dark, heavily embossed plastic card and tossed it confidently onto the silver tray. This is my Tier 1 corporate expense account for Lowell Pike and Crest, Dean stated, looking directly at the manager with an expression of absolute, unwavering authority. The credit line on that piece of plastic is more than enough to buy this entire restaurant twice over. Run it for the full amount, including the second bottle of Burgundy. I will personally sort out the administrative hold with Vanessa's holding company on Monday morning. He leaned back, crossing his arms, fully expecting to be crowned the savior of the evening. He was attempting to use his imaginary corporate might to patch the gaping hole in Vanessa's financial armor. The manager, looking profoundly relieved to have an alternative solution, quickly snatched the corporate card from the tray. He slotted it into the handheld terminal, his thumbs moving rapidly across the keypad to initiate the massive authorization. The table held its collective breath. Vanessa stared at the small digital screen as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. Brooke clutched her linen napkin, the knuckles of her hands turning white. My father leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically between Dean's confident face and the glowing terminal. The machine hummed quietly, processing the encrypted data. It reached out to the merchant provider, routed the request to the corporate banking institution managing the law firm's operational capital, and waited for the absolute confirmation of funds. The terminal flashed. It was not the reassuring green glow of an approved transaction. It was the exact same bright, angry, unforgiving red. The machine let out another sharp double beep. The manager stared at the screen, his mouth falling slightly open in total disbelief. He looked up at Dean, all traces of professional deference entirely erased by pure, unadulterated shock. "Sir," the manager stammered, his voice dropping to an agonizingly loud whisper, The terminal is rejecting your corporate card as well." Dean's confident posture shattered instantly. He lunged forward, snatching the heavy terminal directly out of the manager's hands. He stared at the glowing red screen. his eyes wide, his lips moving silently as he read the error code displayed beneath the decline notification. "Internal hold," Dean read aloud, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming arrogance. It sounded thin, reedy, and laced with absolute terror. "Transaction suspended due to internal hold on the primary corporate credit line." He looked up, his face entirely drained of color. He looked at Vanessa, who was currently staring at her own rejected titanium card as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at my father, who was frozen in a state of catastrophic shock. The air in the private dining room grew instantly cold. The walls, previously insulated by the warm, protective layers of massive wealth and unearned arrogance, suddenly felt like a cage. The impenetrable armor they had worn for decades had just been violently, simultaneously stripped away in the span of 3 minutes. Slowly, almost mechanically. Dean turned his head. Brooke turned her head. My father and Vanessa raised their eyes from the table. One by one, their gazes shifted away from the glowing red terminal, away from the useless plastic and metal scattered on the silver tray, and locked directly onto me. For the absolute first time in my entire life, they were not looking at me as the family disappointment. They were not looking at me as the target for their petty humiliations, nor were they looking at me as the impoverished outcast meant to serve as their tragic contrast. They looked at the plain brown craft paper envelope resting perfectly undisturbed under my hands. They remembered the single, chilling line I had spoken just minutes prior. The laughter was gone. The arrogance was entirely eradicated. As they stared at me from across the table, their eyes wide with a creeping, paralyzing dread, they finally realized they were no longer dealing with a victim. They were staring directly at the architect of their sudden, absolute destruction. And for the first time all night, I was the only person in the room holding the answers. Dean Lowe was the first to successfully reboot his cognitive functions. The profound shock that had temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords morphed violently into the only defensive mechanism he truly understood: aggressive, performative legal intimidation. He shoved his chair back from the table, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, looming over the table, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He pointed a trembling index finger directly at the center of my face. He inhaled deeply, pulling the alpha lawyer persona back over his panicked skeleton like a poorly fitted suit of armor. "I do not know what kind of illegal, amateur hacking stunt you just pulled," Dean bellowed, his voice vibrating with manufactured outrage. "But you have just committed textbook tortious interference with a highly sensitive commercial business operation. You are actively obstructing legitimate commerce. I will personally file an emergency injunction in civil court the second the clerk's office opens on Monday morning. I will have you indicted for unauthorized access to secured financial mainframes. You are looking at federal wire fraud charges. Skylar, you are entirely out of your depth, and I am going to bury you under so much litigation you will never see the light of day." It was a spectacular, desperate display of verbal flailing. He was throwing every intimidating legal phrase he could remember into the air, hoping one of them would land and force me to retreat. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands lightly on the arms, and delivered my counterstrike with the clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a highly infected wound. "You cannot file a tortious interference claim against the primary, senior secured creditor of the very institution you are threatening to defend. Dean," I said. My voice was eerily calm, a stark, chilling contrast to his booming panic. "Furthermore, there is absolutely no unauthorized access occurring here. The restriction on Vanessa's account was automatically triggered by a hard-coded negative covenant embedded within the Series C senior secured convertible mezzanine facility. She executed precisely 48 hours ago." The private dining room fell so silent I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of my analog watch. The general manager of Ardent House, realizing he was witnessing a catastrophic, highly classified corporate execution, had already backed silently out of the room, closing the heavy oak door completely behind him. We were entirely alone. Dean stood frozen, his fingers still pointing uselessly in the air. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. I shifted my gaze from Dean's pale face to Vanessa. She was staring at me as if I had just peeled off a human mask to reveal something utterly monstrous underneath. The sheer terror radiating from her skin was palpable. "You have spent my entire life categorizing me as an uninspired, low-level bookkeeper," I continued, my tone conversational but carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. "You genuinely believed I spent my days filing basic tax returns or logging minor administrative expenses. Allow me to formally introduce myself. I am the managing partner and the chief recovery architect for the North Ledger Restructuring Group." The name of the firm struck the table like a physical detonation. Vanessa gasped, a sharp, ugly sound of raw oxygen hitting her lungs. Her meticulously maintained posture collapsed entirely. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bone white. North Ledger was not a household name. It was not a brand that sponsored charity galas or advertised on glossy magazine covers. It was a phantom, apex predator in the financial ecosystem. We were the highly secretive, deeply specialized distressed asset management firm that quietly purchased the debt of failing companies, stepped into the shadows of the boardroom, and aggressively liquidated their remaining value. And as of this week, we were also the invisible puppet master pulling the strings of Vanessa's entirely fabricated wellness empire. North Ledger is the exclusive managing entity behind Apex Horizon Ventures, I explained, slowly stripping away the protective layers of her greatest triumph. Apex Horizon is the private equity shell corporation that you spent the last 6 months desperately courting. We are the ones who authorized the $45 million capital injection that hit your primary operating account at 9 o'clock this morning. You thought you had finally secured a massive, ignorant angel investor to cover your catastrophic operational bleeding. You did not. You invited a forensic restructuring firm directly into your central nervous system, and you handed us the absolute keys to the kingdom. Vanessa violently shook her head, her heavy diamond earrings swinging erratically. No, she whispered, her voice cracking under the sheer weight of the revelation. "No, that is utterly impossible. I spoke with the managing directors of Apex. I met with them in New York. They loved the expansion model. They loved the brand trajectory. You met with 2 highly paid, contractually obligated actors sitting in a rented conference room," I corrected her, feeling a cold, detached satisfaction as the reality of her situation finally settled into her brain. "They report directly to me. I reviewed every single page of your heavily manipulated prospectus. I saw the massive, glaring discrepancies in your projected recurring revenue. I authorized the funding anyway, strictly to secure the senior collateral rights over all your physical assets." I leaned forward, placing my forearms on the table, closing the physical distance between us. The air around the table felt incredibly heavy, suffocating. "Let us be absolutely clear about how corporate finance actually operates in the real world," I said, stripping away the cinematic illusions Dean had been peddling. "Your money was not arbitrarily seized by a malicious hacker. We do not operate like street thugs. Your holding account was automatically frozen by the institutional gateway because you triggered an internal security protocol. Our lending agreement mandated a strict, continuous deposit account control agreement. The system monitors every single penny that enters and exits your ledger." I paused, allowing the gravity of the control mechanism to sink in. "Exactly 2 hours before this dinner began," I continued, "you attempted to initiate a massive, unapproved outbound wire transfer. You tried to move $2.8 million of our freshly deposited capital out of your primary operational gateway and route it to an entirely unknown, unvetted vendor." Vanessa's head snapped up. The panic in her eyes temporarily gave way to a desperate, wild, cornered defensiveness. She saw a tiny, microscopic sliver of daylight, and she lunged for it. "That was a legitimate vendor payment," Vanessa shrieked, her voice echoing harshly against the acoustic paneling. It was an expedited purchase order for 8 medical-grade, hyperbaric oxygen therapy chambers imported directly from a specialized manufacturer in Switzerland. We need them for the new flagship clinic opening next month. It is standard capital expenditure. You are illegally blocking a vital supply chain transaction. She looked toward my father, her eyes wide, begging him to validate her lie. She was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the brilliant, aggressive businesswoman just trying to execute a complex global trade. I did not even blink. I reached out and gently tapped the plain brown envelope resting in front of me. The entity you attempted to wire $2.8 million to is not a Swiss medical manufacturer, I stated, my voice slicing through her hysterical defense with absolute, unforgiving facts. The recipient listed on the routing mandate is a limited liability company named Vanguard Horizon Consulting. It was incorporated exactly 14 days ago. It possesses no physical warehouse, no manufacturing facility, no employees, and 0 imported medical inventory. The primary registered address is a completely anonymous, unstaffed post office box located in a strip mall on Orange Street in Wilmington, Delaware. I let the specific geographical location hang in the air. Delaware, the universal, highly documented sanctuary for anonymous corporate shells and hidden financial maneuvers. You are not buying hyperbaric chambers, Vanessa, I said quietly. You were attempting to launder our newly injected capital straight out the back door into a private, untraceable offshore holding account before the ink on the promissory note was even dry. My father, who had been sitting in a state of rigid, silent shock for the past 10 minutes, suddenly slumped in his chair. The defensive, arrogant posture he had maintained all evening evaporated completely. Grant Parker was not a sophisticated corporate raider, but he was a man who had spent 30 years desperately clinging to the edges of the financial elite. He knew enough to recognize the distinct, undeniable sound of a death knell. The specific, highly localized details I was providing, the exact legal name of the credit facility, the control agreement protocols, the exact dollar amounts down to the decimal, the anonymous Delaware mail drop. These were not the vague, emotional bluffs typically thrown around during heated family arguments over Thanksgiving dinner. This was the cold, hard, heavily documented language of an apex predator dissecting its prey. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes wide, finally seeing the massive, catastrophic liability he had married. Brooke, entirely out of her depth, simply stared at her empty crystal water glass, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the total inversion of the family hierarchy. Dean slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His aggressively styled hair suddenly looked ridiculous. The blustering, threatening alpha lawyer routine had vanished entirely. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a creeping existential dread. He was a low-tier corporate attorney who specialized in bullying small-time contractors over minor breach of contract disputes. But he recognized the terminology I was using. He knew what a springing lockbox was. He knew what a negative covenant review entailed. He knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that this level of complex, forensic restructuring jargon could not possibly be fabricated on the spot at a dinner table by a low-level administrative assistant. He realized, in a sudden, violent flash of clarity, that he had spent the last hour aggressively condescending to a woman who possessed the unilateral power to liquidate his entire reality. The silence from his side of the table was absolute and profound. I looked around the table, meeting the terrified, completely broken gazes of the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. The transition of power was fully complete. There was no more laughter. There was no more mockery. There was only the suffocating, undeniable weight of the truth. I rested my hands back onto the table, my fingers lightly touching the edge of the craft paper envelope. Tonight I did not come to win an argument, I said, my voice incredibly soft, yet carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. I came to end a sequence of lies. Dean Lowe was a man whose entire psychological architecture was built on a foundation of unearned confidence and aggressive denial. Even as the undeniable reality of his frozen corporate credit line flashed in bright red pixels on the manager's terminal, his brain violently rejected the information. He could not process the concept that the quiet, unremarkable woman he had spent the last hour treating like a peasant was actually the apex predator of his financial ecosystem. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark shade of white, and attempted to reconstruct the shattered narrative he so desperately needed to be true. "This is an elaborate bluff," Dean spat, his voice trembling as he forced a hollow, derisive laugh. He looked toward my father, desperate for an ally. "Grant, do not listen to a single word she is saying. This is a classic, pathetic scare tactic. She is a low-level data processor who probably overheard some high-level executives talking in the elevator at whatever miserable firm she actually works for. She is regurgitating corporate jargon to mask her own massive insecurities. She is completely consumed by jealousy over Vanessa's undeniable success, and she is projecting her own massive life failures onto us to ruin your birthday dinner." He pointed a finger at me again, attempting to summon his courtroom bravado, but his hand was visibly shaking. "You do not control any private equity firm. Skylar, you certainly do not control Apex Horizon, and you absolutely do not have the legal authority to freeze a multi-million-dollar holding account. You are just a bitter, lonely woman throwing a highly technical temper tantrum." I did not offer a rebuttal. Arguing with a man actively drowning in his own delusion was a spectacular waste of oxygen. I preferred to let the documentation perform the execution. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved my phone. I unlocked the screen, bypassing the security protocols, and opened my encrypted corporate email client. I tapped the screen a few times, navigating to a highly secured dossier my forensic team had finalized that very afternoon. "I have just forwarded a primary source document directly to your professional email address." "Dean," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic babbling with the cold, sterile precision of a scalpel. "The address registered to your senior associate profile at Lowell Pike and Crest. I suggest you open it immediately." Dean stared at me, his chest heaving. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to throw his phone across the room to avoid looking at the screen, but the sheer, terrifying gravity of my absolute calm compelled him to act. He reached into his tailored breast pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out his device. He tapped the screen to refresh his inbox. A sharp, electronic chime echoed through the silent private dining room. I watched as his eyes dropped to the illuminated screen. I watched the exact moment his pupils dilated in pure, unfiltered horror. "I want you to read the subject line of that attached legal filing aloud for the benefit of the table," I instructed, leaning back slightly and crossing my legs. "Read it clearly. Dean, let everyone hear exactly how deep my jealousy goes." Dean swallowed hard. His throat made a dry, clicking sound. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own autopsy report. "Read it," I commanded, allowing a fraction of my professional authority to bleed into my tone. "Notice of assignment and assumption of senior secured debt," Dean whispered, his voice cracking horribly. He sounded completely hollowed out. "Regarding the primary operating credit facility of Lowell Pike and Crest Legal Partners," he slowly looked up from the screen, his face entirely drained of blood. "For the past 72 hours, while you were meticulously planning how to humiliate me over a dinner bill, my acquisition team at North Ledger was finalizing the purchase of the distressed commercial paper belonging to your parent financial institution," I explained, mapping out the architecture of his doom. "We now hold the controlling senior debt over your entire law firm. We own the credit line that pays your bloated salary. We own the lease on your lavish downtown office space. We own the operating capital that keeps your partners aggressively billing hours." Dean collapsed back into his chair. The alpha lawyer persona evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified, utterly powerless employee. He understood exactly what this meant. Law firms like his operated on massive leverage and continuous partner draws. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, Your managing partners will receive formal notification of a mandatory comprehensive restructuring protocol, I continued, driving the nails deeper into his professional coffin. We are freezing all partner distributions. We are slashing the discretionary budget by 60%. And we are initiating a brutal forensic review of every single active associate file to determine who is actually generating legitimate revenue and who is merely dead weight in a tailored suit. Vanessa, who had been listening to the systematic dismantling of her son-in-law in stunned silence, let out a sharp, ragged breath. But I was not finished with Dean. The true depth of his liability had not yet been fully exposed. However, your impending unemployment is actually the least of your concerns. Dean, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the mahogany table. During our preliminary conflict of interest sweep earlier this week, my forensic accounting team flagged a highly irregular metadata trail connecting your firm's internal servers to Vanessa's newly formed Delaware shell company. Vanessa flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck. Dean squeezed his eyes shut, a silent confirmation of his profound guilt. You wanted to play the high-powered corporate fixer, I stated, my tone dripping with icy contempt. Vanessa needed to bypass the strict, mandatory related party transaction disclosure clauses embedded in her funding agreement with my firm. She needed to hide the fact that she was the ultimate beneficial owner of the fake medical supply company she was trying to wire $2.8 million to. And you, in a spectacular display of absolute legal malpractice, drafted the fraudulent opinion memo that provided her with a fictional safe harbor provision. My father let out a low, agonizing groan. He was watching his entire manufactured legacy burn to the ground in real time. You intentionally fabricated a legal document to facilitate the embezzlement of secured institutional capital, I clarified, ensuring the waitstaff standing in the hallway outside our heavy oak door could not hear, but that every single person at the table understood the precise criminal terminology. That is not a minor civil dispute. That is a massive, coordinated conspiracy to commit wire fraud. That is a direct violation of federal securities regulations. That is the kind of catastrophic error that ends in permanent disbarment and a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal correctional facility. Brooke suddenly slammed both of her hands onto the table. The sharp impact rattled the crystal water goblets. Her face was flushed with frantic, uncomprehending rage. "Stop it!" Brooke shrieked, her voice echoing wildly in the confined space. "Just stop talking right now. You are completely insane. You have always hated Dean because he is successful, and you are nothing. You cannot just sit here and casually threaten to send my husband to prison over some fabricated paperwork. You are making all of this up to ruin my life." I slowly turned my head, shifting my analytical focus from the broken lawyer to the hysterical, profoundly ignorant golden child. Brooke was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with panic, desperately trying to protect the source of her unearned luxury. "I am not making anything up, Brooke," I replied quietly. "And I highly suggest you lower your voice and think very carefully before you decide to loudly defend a fraudulent enterprise. Because if you insist on dragging yourself into the center of this audit, we will gladly discuss the financial mechanics of your celebrated philanthropic endeavors." Brooke froze. Her mouth remained slightly open, but the frantic screaming died instantly in her throat. The sudden, terrifying pivot caught her entirely off guard. "The Children's Horizon Gala," I stated, naming the massive, highly publicized charity event she hosted every single winter. An incredibly lavish affair. You invite the wealthiest socialites in the city, you serve imported champagne, and you solicit massive donations for underprivileged youth. It is a brilliant strategy for building a pristine personal brand. I reached out and adjusted the alignment of my brown paper envelope, a small, deliberate movement that commanded the absolute attention of the table. "My forensic team ran a standard tracing algorithm on the operational expenditures of your philanthropic foundation," I continued, dissecting her manufactured benevolence. "We did not look at the donations coming in. We looked strictly at the money flowing out. We audited the vendor invoices. We analyzed the event costs." Brooke's face went completely slack. The aggressive, entitled energy drained out of her, replaced by a cold, sickening realization that her darkest, most closely guarded secret was currently resting on a table at a restaurant in the Gold Coast. "We found some fascinating financial anomalies," I noted, my voice maintaining its steady, unrelenting cadence. "We found a transportation invoice for $85,000 for luxury vehicle rentals that were never actually dispatched. We discovered a consulting fee of $120,000 paid to a fictional branding agency that does not possess a valid tax identification number. We found an exorbitant charge of $200,000 for imported venue floral decor, supplied by a company that does not exist on any state registry." I looked directly into Brooke's terrified, tear-filled eyes. "You are not running a charity, Brooke," I stated flatly. "You are running a highly unsophisticated vendor kickback scheme. You are artificially inflating the operational costs of your charity galas by hundreds of thousands of dollars, submitting fraudulent invoices to the foundation, and quietly routing the massive surplus directly back into your private, personal family trust account. You are actively stealing money from a tax-exempt charitable organization to subsidize your designer wardrobe and your luxury vacations." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The absolute, undeniable truth of my statements hung in the air like a thick cloud of toxic gas. They were entirely trapped. The intricate, interlocking web of their financial crimes had been systematically dismantled and laid bare on the pristine white linen. Dean did not attempt to shout anymore. He did not threaten me with imaginary lawsuits. He did not puff up his chest to assert his alpha dominance. The heavy, polished armor of his arrogance had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a profoundly terrified, legally compromised man facing the absolute ruin of his entire life. He leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely more than a ragged, desperate whisper. It was the sound of a man who had finally recognized the sheer magnitude of the predator sitting across from him. "Where did you get that file?" Dean asked quietly. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine, horrified plea for understanding. He was asking how a woman he believed to be a pathetic, entry-level clerk had managed to bypass the encrypted, highly secured internal servers of a massive corporate law firm and a complex web of offshore shell companies. I looked at him. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring blankly at the wall, shivering uncontrollably. I looked at Brooke, who had buried her face in her hands, silently sobbing into her expensive makeup. I offered them the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. I delivered the cold, uncompromising truth about how power actually operates in the modern financial world. I pulled it directly from the systems that you assumed no one would ever bother to read thoroughly, I answered, my voice carrying a heavy, chilling finality. Because until this exact moment, you have only ever dealt with people who are fundamentally afraid of you. The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The chaotic, aggressive energy that had fueled Dean and Brooke's attacks had been entirely neutralized, replaced by the suffocating weight of absolute ruin. Brooke continued to weep quietly into her palms, the sound muffled and pathetic, while Dean stared blankly at the mahogany table, his legal career disintegrating before his very eyes. The theater of their superiority had been burned to the ground, but the core of the rot had not yet been fully exposed. Suddenly, a sharp, violent sound shattered the quiet weeping. My father slammed his heavy crystal water goblet down onto the table. The water sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white linen. His face, previously slack with shock, was now contorted into a mask of desperate, terrified rage. He was a man who had spent his entire life curating an image of absolute control, and the realization that he was standing on a trapdoor had finally overridden his paralysis. "Enough," my father commanded. His voice was raw, scraping against the walls of the private room. He did not look at his weeping daughter or his ruined son-in-law. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a frantic intensity. "Stop dismantling Dean and Brooke. I do not care about their charities or their law firms right now. You look at me, and you tell me exactly what my wife has done with the family assets. You tell me what she has done to my money." The shift in the atmospheric pressure was immediate. We were no longer playing a game of corporate espionage or trading witty, venomous insults over an overpriced dinner. We were standing at the edge of a deeply personal, devastating family tragedy. The target was no longer the arrogant brother-in-law or the spoiled sister. The focus was now squarely on the patriarch and the monumental, catastrophic illusion he had traded his family to protect. I did not offer a smug smile. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and placed my hands on the plain brown craft paper envelope that had sat silently in front of me all evening. The entire table watched as I finally lifted the flap. It was not a handmade birthday card. It was not a rejected cover letter. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of tightly bound, legally certified financial documents. I slid the stack across the smooth mahogany surface, stopping it exactly 1 inch from my father's clenched fists. "I want you to look at the second page, Grant," I instructed, my voice maintaining a low, steady cadence, completely stripped of any vindictive edge. "Look at the property records." My father hesitated. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely separate the heavy parchment pages. When he finally flipped to the designated document, his eyes scanned the bold, capitalized heading. "Parker Point Lodge," I said, speaking the name of the property aloud. It was the sprawling, deeply cherished lakefront cabin that had been in our family for over 4 decades. It was the only tangible piece of legacy my late mother had left behind, a place completely detached from the superficial, toxic social climbing of his new life. It was completely paid off. It was supposed to be untouchable. Vanessa did not just run a deficit on her luxury clinics, I explained, mapping out the architecture of his betrayal. When the private equity funds initially refused her requests for emergency bridge capital, she needed massive liquidity to cover the negative cash flow and maintain the illusion of rapid expansion. She turned to the only unencumbered asset left in your portfolio. Vanessa let out a low, whimpering sound, burying her face behind her hands. She executed a highly complex refinancing maneuver, I continued, forcing him to hear the mechanics of his own ruin. She utilized a sophisticated digital forgery platform to replicate your electronic signature. She then submitted a heavily altered, fraudulent power of attorney document to a mid-tier commercial lender. Because you are legally married and share a primary residence, the underwriters push the authorization through without requiring a mandatory, in-person verification meeting. My father stared at the document, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "She took out a mortgage," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "She did not just take out a single mortgage," I corrected him, maintaining the agonizing, factual precision of a forensic auditor. "She layered the debt. She secured a primary residential loan for $2,500,000. 30 days later, she leveraged the remaining equity to secure a secondary, short-term mezzanine line of credit for an additional $800,000 at a crippling 18% interest rate." The numbers hung in the air, heavy and fatal. "She hollowed out the entire foundation of the property," I said, my eyes fixed on his crumbling facade. "But the clinics were burning through capital faster than she could steal it. The property loans were not enough to plug the holes in her failing business model. So, she moved on to your liquid assets." I instructed him to turn to the 4th page of the dossier. "Look at the disbursement logs from your primary retirement trust," I said. "Over the past 8 months, she has initiated 14 separate, unauthorized wire transfers. She systematically liquidated your blue-chip stock portfolio and drained your fixed income accounts. Because she forced the sales well before the maturity dates, the accounts incurred massive, catastrophic early withdrawal penalties. You lost 40% of the total value purely to tax levies and banking fines before the cash even hit her corporate shell company." My father did not argue. He did not yell at me that I was lying. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. His fingers fumbled aggressively with the screen as he bypassed the lock and opened his private wealth management application. The private dining room was dead silent, save for the frantic tapping of his thumb against the glass. The soft, artificial blue glow of the phone illuminated his face, highlighting every deep wrinkle, every gray hair, and the sudden, profound hollowing of his cheeks. He watched the loading icon spin, and then the dashboard materialized. I watched the exact moment his entire reality snapped in half. I watched his shoulders collapse inward. I watched his jaw drop, his mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream. The robust, arrogant patriarch, who had proudly commanded the head of the table just an hour ago, simply vanished. In his place sat an old, broken, thoroughly exhausted man who had just realized he was completely, terrifyingly broke. The balances on his screen matched my documents down to the absolute final decimal point. He had been completely gutted from the inside out, while sleeping in the exact same bed as the parasite who did it. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the wood, the screen still broadcasting his financial devastation for anyone to see. Vanessa, sensing the absolute totality of her exposure, dropped her hands from her face. The predatory, polished businesswoman was gone. She launched into the final, desperate refuge of a cornered narcissist weaponized victimhood. "I had to do it! Grant!" Vanessa cried out, her voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical frequency. She reached across the table, desperately trying to grab his arm, but he physically recoiled from her touch as if she were made of fire. "You have absolutely no idea what it takes to maintain our position in this city. You love the galas. You love the respect the clinics needed the capital to stay afloat. If the business failed, we would have lost all our social equity. The country club would have dropped us. Our friends would have turned their backs. I did not do this to hurt you. I did it to protect our lifestyle. I did it for us." She looked around the room, tears streaming down her flawlessly contoured face, pleading for someone, anyone, to validate her delusion. She wanted to frame her massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement as an act of tragic, necessary marital sacrifice. She wanted to be the martyr of the Gold Coast. I did not yell at her. I did not pound my fists on the table or launch into a moralistic lecture about the sanctity of family trust. I simply sat there, observing the pathetic, flailing mechanics of a lifelong con artist desperately trying to pivot the narrative. When she finally stopped shouting, leaving her desperate echoes to die against the acoustic paneling, I asked her a single, incredibly practical question. "If you truly liquidated my father's entire life savings and illegally mortgaged his family legacy to protect the collective marital unit," I asked, my voice cutting through her hysteria with the cold, sterile edge of absolute logic. "If this massive influx of stolen capital was genuinely for us, then why does the offshore holding account currently receiving the redirected funds list only one sole, ultimate beneficial owner?" The hysterical crying stopped instantly. Vanessa froze, her mouth still slightly open, her eyes darting frantically toward the door as if calculating the physical distance required to escape the room. The dramatic, weeping martyr act evaporated the second the cold light of forensic data hit it. "I have the incorporation documents from the Cayman Islands registry," I continued, refusing to let her breathe. "The holding account is completely isolated from the primary clinic infrastructure. It is insulated from any joint marital claims. You were not trying to save the business, Vanessa. You were meticulously building a golden parachute. You were draining every single drop of blood from Grant's accounts, so you could quietly file for divorce the moment the clinics officially filed for bankruptcy. You were preparing to abandon him with millions of dollars in highly leveraged, fraudulent debt while you disappeared with the remaining liquid cash." I turned my gaze back to my father. Grant Parker did not say a word. He did not cry, nor did he scream. The silence that emanated from him was heavier and far more terrifying than any explosion of rage. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting limply on his lap, staring directly across the table at the woman he had married. For 20 years, he had worshipped at the altar of her manufactured perfection. He had alienated his eldest daughter, subsidized the cruelty of his youngest, and lived well beyond his means, all to prove he was worthy of standing next to her in the photographs. Now, The expensive lighting of Ardent House seemed incredibly harsh, illuminating every jagged, ugly crack in her facade. He was not looking at a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur. He was not looking at a loving, devoted wife who shared his ambitious dreams. He was looking at a complete and utter stranger. He was looking at the architect of his absolute destruction, a woman who had smiled at him over expensive breakfasts while actively forging his signature to steal his home. The profound, suffocating silence of the patriarch echoed louder than any argument ever could. The illusion was entirely dead, and the reality he was left with was nothing but ash. The suffocating silence that had enveloped my father was far too heavy for Vanessa to endure. Her survival instinct, honed by decades of ruthless social climbing and desperate financial maneuvering, violently rejected the absolute corner I had painted her into. She abruptly pushed her chair back, the heavy wooden legs screeching harshly against the polished floorboards, and stood up to loom over the table. Her chest heaved. The tears of martyrdom she had manufactured just moments prior vanished entirely, replaced by a feral, cornered, and deeply vicious desperation. "You genuinely think you have won," Vanessa hissed, her voice vibrating with venom and raw panic. "You think you can just walk into this restaurant, drop a few legally dubious spreadsheets onto the table, and destroy my entire life. You have absolutely no idea who you are actually dealing with. Skylar, my public relations team is the most aggressive crisis management firm in the Midwest. I have heavyweight private equity investors backing my clinics. These are men who manage billions of dollars. They are titans of industry. If you try to leak any of this fabricated garbage to the press, they will crush you. They will bury your little restructuring firm in so much retaliatory litigation, you will be disbarred and utterly bankrupt before the end of the fiscal year." She was practically shaking with the effort of projecting a power she no longer possessed. She was clinging to the phantom strength of her invisible backers, hoping to intimidate me with the sheer, overwhelming weight of institutional capital. I did not even blink. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and watched her unravel. "You are entirely missing the fundamental architecture of the trap you are currently standing in," I replied, my voice maintaining its chilling, even cadence. "Those heavyweight investors you just threatened me with do not actually exist. The titans you believe are waiting in the wings to protect your fraudulent empire are nothing more than legally registered paper entities." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave of my hand. "Apex Horizon Ventures is a strictly intermediary holding company," I explained, systematically dismantling her final psychological fortress. "It is a pass-through entity wholly owned and exclusively operated by North Ledger. The aggressive men in the expensive bespoke suits you pitched your expansion model to in New York. They were mid-level acquisition analysts following my direct script. You have never once met the actual decision-makers. Vanessa, you never met the people who hold the ultimate authority over your capital, because the person with the absolute, unilateral power to liquidate your entire existence has been sitting right across this table from you for the past 2 hours." She stared at me, the blood completely draining from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. The realization that she had willingly invited her most despised stepdaughter into the central nervous system of her company struck her with physical, paralyzing force, but I was not going to let her simply process the shock. The execution required total, irreversible momentum. The walls needed to close in completely. While you were busy trying to humiliate me by forcing me to pay for an exorbitant dinner, I continued, increasing the tempo of my delivery to match the rapid, catastrophic collapse of her reality. My legal team was standing in front of a judge at the Cook County Civil Court. Exactly 2 hours before I arrived at Ardent House tonight, we formally filed an ex parte petition for an emergency receivership over your entire network of clinics. Dean, who had been staring blankly at his own hands in a state of professional ruin, suddenly snapped his head up. The legal terminology acted like a bucket of ice water to his paralyzed brain. He knew exactly what a receivership meant. It meant the total, immediate loss of operational control. It meant a court-appointed official was currently seizing the physical keys to Vanessa's empire. You cannot do that without establishing an immediate, undeniable threat of massive asset dissipation, Dean blurted out, his voice hoarse, the instinctual lawyer reflex firing blindly in the dark. You have no internal proof. You only have circumstantial wire logs from the outside. I shifted my analytical gaze to Dean, acknowledging his desperate attempt to find a procedural technicality. We have far more than circumstantial wire logs, I corrected him, driving the final nail into the coffin. We have a fully executed sworn affidavit of cooperation from your former chief operating officer. Vanessa swayed heavily on her feet. She reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white, just to keep her knees from buckling. Marcus, she whispered, breathing out the name of her most trusted second-in-command like a curse. Marcus, I confirmed flatly. When my forensic team quietly presented him with the undeniable evidence of your embezzlement yesterday afternoon, he realized he was legally exposed as an accessory to federal wire fraud. He made the highly intelligent, deeply practical decision to save himself. He surrendered his entire encrypted hard drive to our auditors. We possess every single internal communication log, every hidden email thread instructing the accounting department to falsify the daily revenue reports, and the exact, synchronized schedule of your illegal wire transfers. I looked directly into Vanessa's terrified, hyperventilating eyes. Your absolute denials are legally worthless, I stated, my tone offering zero quarter. The perimeter is entirely breached. By 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the locks on your corporate headquarters will be changed. Your operational servers will be physically seized by federal marshals, and your personal assets will be entirely frozen pending a full Department of Justice inquiry. Dean lunged forward, grabbing Vanessa's forearm with a sudden, bruising grip. The arrogant, blustering alpha male who had proudly lectured me on corporate dominance was completely gone, replaced by a terrified man desperate to stop the catastrophic bleeding. Sit down and shut your mouth immediately, Dean hissed at his mother-in-law, his voice trembling with genuine, raw panic. Do not say another word. Every single syllable you speak right now is an adverse admission of guilt. She is wearing a wire, or she has the manager recording us through the security system. You have to invoke your absolute right to remain silent and leave this building right now. He understood that the game of social superiority was permanently over. He was no longer trying to win an argument. He was just trying to mitigate the impending, highly publicized federal prison sentences. But the unity of their toxic alliance had already shattered. The crushing pressure of absolute, undeniable ruin turned them into feral animals trapped in a burning cage. Brooke abruptly stood up, her chair crashing backward onto the polished floor with a violent thud. Her tear-streaked face was contorted into a mask of pure, selfish fury. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband and then whipped her hand toward her mother. You dragged me into this, Brooke screamed, her voice echoing violently off the acoustic panels, entirely abandoning the refined, aristocratic persona she valued above all else. She looked at Dean with absolute disgust. You told me the charity structure was perfectly legal. You said setting up the vendor kickbacks was just standard wealth management for high-net-worth individuals. You assured me I was completely insulated from any forensic audit. She violently spun toward Vanessa, her eyes wide and wild. And you promised you had the clinic financing entirely under control. You used my name on the advisory board to secure the initial round of funding, and now you have permanently tied my reputation to a massive federal fraud investigation. You both ruined my life just to maintain your stupid, pathetic egos. The elegant, unified front they had presented at the beginning of the evening had completely cannibalized itself. They were screaming at each other across the table, trading vicious accusations and desperate blame. They were tearing each other apart with the exact same cruelty they had reserved exclusively for me just an hour prior. The room sounded like a chaotic, violent shipwreck. I watched them destroy each other with absolute, clinical detachment. Then, a sudden, desperate movement caught my attention. My father, who had remained frozen in a state of catastrophic shock while his family imploded around him, slowly reached his hands across the wide expanse of the mahogany table. His fingers, trembling uncontrollably, brushed gently against my own. It was the very first time in my entire adult life he had initiated physical contact without a camera flashing or a wealthy social audience to impress. I looked at him. The arrogant, posturing patriarch was completely gone. His face was gray, his eyes wide and deeply pleading. He looked like a man drowning in a freezing ocean, desperately reaching out for the only piece of solid driftwood in sight. "Skylar," my father whispered. His voice broke completely, stripping away decades of performative superiority. He was genuinely lowering himself. He was begging, "Please, the money is gone. The clinics are dead. I understand that. But Parker Point Lodge, that cabin was your mother's. It is the absolute last piece of our real family I have left in this world. You are the chief architect. You run the restructuring firm. You hold the controlling debt." He swallowed hard, heavy tears finally spilling over his lower eyelids and tracking down his hollowed cheeks. "Please, Skylar, save the house first. We can deal with the criminal charges. We can deal with Dean and Vanessa and everyone else later. Just tell me you can save the house." It was a profound, agonizing moment. He was finally acknowledging my power. Not because he respected my intelligence or loved me as a daughter, but strictly because he was entirely broken, and I was the only person on the planet capable of rescuing him from his own disastrous choices. I did not pull my hands away from his trembling fingers. I looked directly into his desperate, weeping eyes. "I have already designed a comprehensive asset protection strategy," I answered, my voice steady, offering no false comfort, but projecting absolute, undeniable certainty. "The property can be entirely severed from Vanessa's toxic commercial liabilities. The foreclosure procedures can be halted immediately." A wave of profound, agonizing relief washed over his face, but I instantly raised my hand to stop him, before he could utter a word of thanks. "However," I cautioned, my tone hardening into unforgiving steel, "the execution of that protective strategy is entirely contingent upon a fundamental choice you must make right now. For the past 20 years, you have consistently chosen the illusion of wealth over the reality of your family. You have chosen the aggressive, manufactured prestige of this woman over the quiet, undeniable truth of my existence. If you want me to deploy my firm to save that property, you must actively, legally cooperate with the receivership." I let the heavy, fatal weight of the conditions settle deep into his bones. "You cannot protect her anymore, Grant," I stated. "You must choose the cold, absolute truth, or you can continue to choose your fragile, shattered pride and lose absolutely everything." My father stared at me, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. He looked at the screaming, vicious fight occurring between his wife and his golden child. He looked at the ruined, terrified lawyer he had once proudly called his son. The pristine, highly curated life he had sacrificed his own daughter to build was nothing but a toxic, burning crater. Before he could vocalize his final decision, the heavy oak door of the private dining room swung open. The general manager stood in the threshold. He did not step inside the room. His face was incredibly pale, his posture rigid with deep, unprecedented professional anxiety. He kept his eyes strictly focused on the floor, desperate to avoid making eye contact with any of the screaming, broken people in the enclave. "I sincerely apologize for the absolute intrusion," the manager announced, raising his voice just enough to cut through the chaotic shouting of the family. "But there is a gentleman waiting in the main lobby. He has explicitly identified himself as a court-appointed process server, and he is accompanied by 2 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department." The screaming between Brooke, Dean, and Vanessa stopped instantaneously. A sudden, terrifying silence descended upon the room once again. "He explicitly stated that he cannot leave the premises until he obtains physical, verified signatures on several emergency legal mandates," the manager concluded, his voice tight with dread. The storm I had engineered was no longer confined to the theoretical space of a dinner argument. The absolute unforgiving reality of the law had just arrived at the front door of the most exclusive restaurant in the city, and the final execution was officially underway. The heavy oak door swung open completely, pushed not by the deferential white-gloved waitstaff, but by the heavy, authoritative hand of a Cook County process server. He stepped into the private enclave, his presence an absolute, glaring anomaly against the cascading crystal chandeliers and the meticulously applied gold leaf accents of Ardent House. He wore a rumpled gray suit that screamed of fluorescent-lit municipal buildings, holding a thick stack of legal documents securely attached to a heavy clipboard. Right behind him stood two uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department, their dark service belts creaking slightly in the suffocating silence of the room. Vanessa scrambled backward. Her chair tipped over, hitting the hardwood floor with a violent, echoing crack. Her instinct was pure, primal flight. She grabbed her heavily branded, imported leather clutch and lunged toward the secondary service door connecting to the kitchen corridor. One of the uniformed officers stepped smoothly into her path. His posture relaxed but entirely immovable. The process server cleared his throat. He did not care about the exorbitant minimum spend of the room or the rare French burgundy breathing in the corner. He looked directly at the terrified woman backed against the acoustic paneling. "Vanessa Locke," he asked, his voice carrying the bored, mechanical cadence of a man who ruined lives for a living. "I am serving you with a certified copy of an emergency receivership order issued by the civil court. This mandate officially strips you of all operational control over your clinical network, effective immediately. It also includes a comprehensive injunction freezing your personal banking assets, your corporate holding accounts, and any secondary financial instruments bearing your legal name. I need your physical signature on the receipt of service before you are permitted to leave this premises." Vanessa's breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. She lunged toward Dean. "Do something!" she shrieked, her voice cracking horribly. "You are a corporate attorney. You are family. Represent me right now. Tell them they cannot ambush me in a restaurant without prior legal notification. File a motion to dismiss Dean Lowe, the man who had spent the entire evening pontificating about his alpha dominance and his aggressive courtroom strategies, physically recoiled from her. He took 2 large steps backward, putting as much distance between himself and his mother-in-law as the confined space would allow. "I cannot represent you, Vanessa," Dean stammered, his voice thin and reedy, completely devoid of its former booming arrogance. "I am actively invoking a massive conflict of interest. Given the fraudulent nature of the opinion memo you coerced me into drafting, my own firm is now fundamentally compromised. Any legal advice I give you right now could be construed as further participation in a federal conspiracy. I am stepping away from this entirely. You are on your own." He was officially abandoning ship, prioritizing his own fragile survival over the woman he had eagerly defended just an hour prior. Brooke could not handle the rapid, catastrophic disintegration of her reality. The golden child, who had spent her entire life insulated by Grant's money and Vanessa's ruthless climbing, broke down completely. She let out a loud, agonizing sob, her face buried in her hands. She did not go to comfort her mother. She grabbed Dean by the sleeve of his tailored suit and yanked him toward the main exit. "Get me out of here," Brooke sobbed hysterically. "Get me out of this room right now. Dean, I cannot be seen with her when the police are here. The charity board will fire me. We have to leave." Dean did not argue. He offered no parting words, no final threats, and absolutely no apologies. He put his arm around his weeping wife, and together, they practically fled the private dining room. The grand unified alliance that had sat around this mahogany table specifically to mock my clothing, my career, and my entire existence had completely cannibalized itself. They scattered like roaches the absolute second the bright light of accountability was turned on, abandoning each other right in the exact center of the room where they had laughed at me the loudest. The process server stepped forward, thrusting the heavy clipboard and a cheap plastic pen toward Vanessa. She took it with trembling, erratic hands, her perfectly painted fingernails scratching against the paper as she signed her own professional death warrant. Without saying another word, she dropped the clipboard onto the silver service tray, pushed past the officers, and walked out of the door. Her posture was entirely broken, her expensive silk dress suddenly looking like a heavy, tragic shroud. And then, there were only two. The officers and the process server nodded silently and exited, pulling the heavy oak door shut, leaving me entirely alone with my father. The silence that rushed back into the room was profound. It was not the tense, aggressive silence of our earlier standoff. It was the absolute, hollow quiet of a total systemic collapse. The $14,000 bottle of wine sat untouched. The imported caviar was melting into a pathetic, salty puddle. The celebration was dead. Grant Parker remained in his chair at the head of the table. He looked incredibly small. The robust, arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by an aging, exhausted man who had just watched his entire manufactured legacy evaporate in the span of 30 minutes. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were red, deeply bloodshot, and utterly devoid of pride. "They are all gone," my father whispered, stating the obvious fact as if his brain was struggling to process the visual data. "Everything is gone. The money. The respect. The marriage." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully against his starched collar. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and buried his face in his hands for a long moment. When he finally looked back up, the desperate, pleading expression from earlier had intensified tenfold. "Skylar," he began, his voice trembling with a raw, uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know I sat at this table and allowed them to humiliate you, but you said you had a strategy. You said you could stop the foreclosure on Parker Point Lodge. That house is the absolute last piece of your mother I have left. It is the only real, clean thing remaining in my life. Please, tell me what I have to do to save the house." I looked at the broken man sitting across from me. I did not feel a sudden, warm rush of familial reconciliation. I did not feel the urge to run over and hug him. I felt only a cold, clinical sense of closure. I reached out and placed my hands on the plain brown craft paper envelope for the final time. "I already stopped the foreclosure, Grant," I stated quietly. His eyes widened in sudden, desperate hope. "Before I even walked into this restaurant tonight," I explained, maintaining my steady analytical cadence, "my firm executed a quiet, unilateral buyout of the distressed secondary mortgage Vanessa illegally took out on the property. We paid off the short-term mezzanine debt in full. We absorbed the primary residential loan. The commercial bank has completely released the lien. The property is no longer under any threat of seizure from Vanessa's corporate creditors." My father let out a ragged, agonizing gasp of relief. He slumped back into his chair, closing his eyes as a fresh wave of tears tracked down his deeply lined face. "Thank you," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Skylar. I promise I will maintain it. I promise I will keep it in the family." "You are misunderstanding the structural reality of the situation," I interrupted, my tone suddenly dropping the ambient temperature of the room by several degrees. "I did not clear the massive debt on that property to save Vanessa from prison, and I certainly did not clear it to rescue your bruised ego. I paid the arrears strictly to preserve the legacy of my biological mother, and because my firm absorbed the debt, my firm now holds the absolute, unencumbered deed to the land." Grant's eyes snapped open. The relief instantly vanished, replaced by a creeping, terrified confusion. "When I packed this envelope this morning," I continued, tracing the rough edge of the paper with my index finger, "my original intention was to walk into this dinner, hand you the fully cleared deed, and transfer absolute, unconditional ownership back into your name. It was meant to be a genuine birthday gift, a 63rd birthday present to wipe the slate clean and start over." I paused, letting the ghost of that hypothetical reconciliation hang heavily in the air between us. "But then I sat at this table," I said, my voice hardening into an unforgiving metallic edge. I watched you sit in silence while your fraudulent wife mocked my career. I watched you actively applaud the arrogant brother-in-law who thought offering me a clerical job was a massive act of charity. I watched you demand that I drain my own checking account to pay for a $25,000 dinner simply to prove my worth to a family that has never valued me. You proved to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you cannot be trusted with absolute authority. I slid the envelope across the table. It stopped directly in front of him. "Open it," I commanded. My father reached out with shaking hands and pulled out the final stack of documents. "I am not giving you the deed," I announced, delivering my final, binding decision. "I have officially transferred the absolute ownership of Parker Point Lodge into a newly established, ironclad legal entity. It is called the Eleanor Parker Legacy Trust, named entirely in honor of my mother." Grant stared at the trust documents, his eyes scanning the heavily bolded legal parameters. "I am the sole, unilateral executor of that trust," I explained. "You do not own the cabin anymore, Grant. However, the trust grants you a strict, highly conditional life use right. You are permitted to reside in the property for the remainder of your natural life. You will have a roof over your head, completely insulated from the massive financial fallout Vanessa is about to drag you through." He looked up at me, his face a complex map of profound gratitude and absolute crushing defeat. "But that residency comes with unbreakable covenants," I warned him, leaning forward to ensure he understood the absolute finality of my terms. "You will cooperate fully and entirely with the federal investigators regarding Vanessa's embezzlement. You will not attempt to hide assets. You will not lie to protect her. And you will never, under any circumstances, allow her to set foot on that property again. You cannot sell the land. You cannot leverage it for a loan. You cannot pass it down to Brooke in your will. You are merely a tenant, and I am the landlord. If you violate a single term of this agreement, the trust will instantly revoke your residency, and you will be entirely homeless." The power dynamic, which had defined our relationship for over 3 decades, was finally, permanently inverted. Grant Parker realized, in that exact devastating moment, that he had entirely lost the power to issue commands. The patriarchal authority he had always assumed was a divine right had been systematically stripped away. He was now completely dependent on the mercy and the strict, unforgiving oversight of the daughter he had spent his entire life treating as a failure. He looked down at the trust document, his trembling fingers tracing the name of his late wife. He offered no argument. He possessed no leverage. He simply nodded his head in silent, absolute surrender. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed out the front of my unbranded charcoal wool blazer. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple leather wallet. I extracted exactly $250 in cash. I placed the crisp bills neatly onto the table, right next to my untouched crystal water goblet. "That covers my sparkling water, my single appetizer, and a generous 22% gratuity for the waitstaff who had to endure this circus," I stated calmly. I picked up my scuffed oxblood leather briefcase. I looked down at my father one last time. He remained seated at the head of the ruined table, a broken king entirely surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogant choices. "You were absolutely right about one thing tonight, Grant," I said, delivering the final, chilling verdict of the evening. "Tonight, I behaved exactly like someone belonging to your elevated world. The only difference is, I arrived at this table as the senior secured creditor, not a pathetic beggar asking for your validation." I turned my back on the mahogany table, the melting caviar, and the weeping patriarch. I pushed open the heavy oak door and walked out of the private dining room, leaving nothing behind me but absolute, unbroken silence. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how the evening unfolded. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to Amelia Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.